the banned medieval blacksmith code that turned scrap metal into unbreakable tools. Lost for 500 years. Welcome back to Historia Prime. Imagine yourself in a dim, sweltering workshop at the height of the Middle Ages. The air trembles with heat. Coal smoke curls through the rafters. A blacksmith lifts a glowing bar of iron from a roaring fire, lays it onto an anvil, and begins to strike. Each blow cracks like thunder. Each spark is a fragment of transformation, and in that tiny room of smoke and sweat, you are watching something far more profound than simple labor. You are witnessing a man performing a kind of alchemy. To the peasants passing by, he was just another craftsman. But to kings, knights, and the guarded guilds of Europe, he was dangerous. A keeper of a forbidden code. A man whose knowledge, if leaked, could cost him exile, maiming, or the kind of social death that erased your name from memory. For centuries, we dismissed this era as the Dark Ages, imagining crude tools and primitive weapons. But the truth is far stranger. These smiths, working in dirt floor huts, were engineering materials so advanced that modern scientists only recently understood them. They were manipulating heat, impurities, and crystalline structures at a microscopic level. Some were even forging weapons with nanoscale patterns centuries before microscopes existed. And today, we open that vault. We will uncover how they turned shattered scrap into blades of legend, why they quenched red-hot steel in shocking, almost unbelievable liquids, and how their banned techniques reveal practical lessons for a modern world drowning in disposable products. Lessons about patience, resourcefulness, and the power hidden inside the broken pieces of our own lives. Settle in, and if you haven't already, hit subscribe, because what you're about to see will change the way you understand history and what you believe you're capable of forging yourself. Part 1. The Ultimate Survivalists and the Alchemy of Scrap. Picture medieval Europe for a moment. If you were stranded there, your survival hinged on one person, the blacksmith. Before kings made laws or armies marched, the smith shaped the tools that fed villages and forged the weapons that drew borders. Yet behind this power was a simple truth. Raw iron was painfully difficult to create. To produce even a single pound, iron ore had to endure the bloomery, a clay and stone furnace running on charcoal, blasted with hand-pumped bellows. It stripped oxygen from the ore and left behind a spongy bloom, half metal, half slag, and the process devoured resources. Hundreds of pounds of charcoal and ore for a few usable fragments. It was slow, brutal, and unforgiving. This scarcity shaped the blacksmith's genius. Nothing was ever thrown away. A broken plough was not trash, it was raw material waiting for rebirth. Smiths ransacked abandoned Roman ruins, prying iron from crumbling beams and forgotten nails. Every scrap mattered because every scrap could be transformed. And so emerged one of their most remarkable techniques, faggoting. They gathered shattered horseshoes, bent hinges, and broken nails, stacked them together, then heated the mass until it glowed white. Under the hammer, the bundle fused into a single bar, but only if the smith defeated the enemy of every weld, iron oxide. Their answer was deceptively simple. Sprinkle silica sand or borax, let it melt into a liquid glass, and watch it flow out under the hammer, leaving a clean, solid bond. Through heat, pressure, and timing, waste became strength. And within that transformation lies a lesson. Today we live in a culture that discards anything slightly damaged, a world built on planned obsolescence. But the medieval blacksmith saw potential in what was broken. He understood that fragments, when gathered with intention, could become something stronger than before. So when your plans crack or your path bends, remember the anvil. Don't throw the pieces away, collect them. Apply pressure with purpose. Shape them into something new. What looks like scrap may be the beginning of your most resilient work. Part 2. The Magic Quench. blood, urine, and thermodynamics. Now we enter the most mysterious moment in a blacksmith's craft, the stage where strength is born or lost in a single breath. If forge welding was the muscle of the medieval smith, then heat treatment was undeniably the soul. Every blade, every chisel, every tool stood at a crossroads when the metal reached that perfect cherry-red glow. Too cool, and it remained soft and useless. Too hot, and it crumbled into grainy ash, but struck at precisely the right moment and plunged into liquid. It transformed into martensite, a crystalline structure so hard it bordered on impossible. And this is where the story bends from science into something that feels like sorcery. When historians first opened medieval guild manuals, they encountered quenching recipes that looked absurd, even disturbing. Theophilus Presbyter, a 12th century monk and meticulous craftsman, wrote instructions that sound straight out of an occult ritual. He advised quenching red-hot steel in the urine of a small red-headed boy, or in the urine of a goat fed nothing but ferns. Other texts mention pigeon droppings, animal fat, radish juice, or even the blood of a white horse. For generations, scholars dismissed these instructions as superstition, evidence that medieval metallurgy was guided by ritual instead of knowledge. But modern science has revealed something remarkable. These smiths weren't foolish. They were experimenting, observing, and manipulating thermodynamics centuries before anyone named the laws. Because here is the truth they understood, even if they couldn't explain it. When steel at 1,500 degrees plunges into pure cold water, that water doesn't cool it. Not immediately. It flashes into steam, wrapping the blade in a protective sheath, a steam envelope, that slows cooling and ruins the hardening process. What the smith needed was not water, but disruption, a way to shatter that insulative barrier, and that is exactly what those bizarre ingredients did. Salts, nitrates, fats, and organic particles broke the steam jacket instantly. No insulating layer, no hesitation, just a violent, uniform quench that forced the crystal structure into its hardest form. It wasn't magic, it wasn't myth. It was empirical science uncovered through centuries of trial, error, and ruthless attention to detail. And hidden inside this strange chapter is a lesson for us today. We often reject unconventional ideas the moment they sound unfamiliar or uncomfortable. We assume wisdom must come dressed in modern language, backed by equations, charts, and credentials. Yet, over and over, history shows us that breakthroughs are born from people willing to try what others ridicule. People who watch closely. People who notice small things. So when life presents you with a problem that defies the usual solutions, remember the quench. Don't be afraid of methods that seem odd at first glance. The question isn't whether an idea sounds reasonable. The question is whether it works. Sometimes the path to strength runs straight through the unexpected. Part 3. The Ulfbert Enigma and the Steel from the Future. Now we arrive at one of the most unsettling mysteries in medieval metallurgy, a weapon so advanced it seems to have slipped out of its own century. Between the 8th and 11th centuries, as Viking warbands swept across northern Europe, a strange sword began to appear on the battlefield. Etched into its blade was a single inscription, plus VLFBERHT plus. To the warriors who carried it, this name was more than decoration. It was a promise of dominance, a symbol of status, and ultimately, a terror on the field. Yet to modern archaeologists, the Ulfbert raises a question so profound it fractures the historical timeline. When researchers analyzed authentic Ulfbert blades, they found something impossible for the Middle Ages. The steel contained roughly 1% carbon, triple what any European sword of the era achieved, and even more astonishing, it was nearly free of slag. To purify steel to that level, the metal must reach temperatures of about 1,650 degrees Celsius, or 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit. And here lies the contradiction. According to everything we know, no European forge had the technology to reach those temperatures until the Industrial Revolution, nearly 8 centuries later. Yet the evidence sits right there in the earth, a weapon built with a level of precision that should not have existed. So how did they do it? The theories are as dramatic as the sword itself. Some historians argue the blades were made from imported crucible steel, brought along the Volga trade route from Central Asia. Others, studying trace elements in the metal, point to manganese-rich iron ore from German mines. That clue suggests something even more intriguing. A small, extremely secretive circle of European smiths, perhaps Frankish monks, may have developed their own crucible process. If true, it means a hidden brotherhood produced steel centuries ahead of its time, guarded the method fiercely, and allowed only a limited number of these near-mythic blades to enter the world. And because they were so coveted, counterfeits soon followed. Medieval blacksmiths, eager to cash in on the Ulfbert name, began stamping crude, misspelled imitations into inferior blades. The battlefield became the testing ground. A real Ulfbert cut through armor with frightening ease. A fake shattered the moment it met a Viking shield. It was, in essence, the world's first luxury knockoff industry and the first consumer test nightmare. But the deeper lesson is not about swords. It is about authenticity. A counterfeit blade can mimic the look, the markings, even the legend. But under real pressure, it breaks. And in our modern world, where so many people present polished versions of themselves, online, in work, in identity, the same truth remains. What survives impact is not image, but integrity. So cultivate depth. Build skill that withstands heat and force. Refuse shortcuts. Refuse impurities. Become, in your own craft and character, the blade that does not fracture. Because the world doesn't need more replicas, it needs more Ulfberts. Part 4. The Band Code and the Guilds. This is where the story of medieval steel shifts from technology to power. In a world where few understood fire, ore, and heat, anyone who could build a forge, smelt a blade like an Ulfbert, or master the quench held influence far beyond their station. Knowledge was currency, and in the Middle Ages, that currency was tightly controlled by the guilds. A boy who wished to become a blacksmith entered this world through obedience. At around 12, he swore an oath to his master, promising loyalty and absolute secrecy. For his first year, he did not touch the iron at all. He swept floors, stoked fires, and pumped bellows, learning not through instruction, but by absorbing the rhythm and ritual of the forge. Only after years of service did he become a journeyman, and only a select few ever reached mastery. The guilds called their techniques mysteries, and for good reason. The blacksmith stood in a liminal space, half craftsman, half sorcerer. He commanded fire powerful enough to melt stone and coax metal into new shapes. Churches warned that the roaring forge resembled the mouth of the underworld. Villagers whispered that smiths consorted with spirits. Reverence and fear wrapped around them in equal measure. And because their power was feared, the code protecting their secrets was severe. Although execution was rare and reserved for treason, lesser punishments were harsh enough to destroy a life. A smith who betrayed a guild secret could be fined into ruin, permanently maimed, or, worst of all, cast out. Social death meant exile from the trade, no forge, no livelihood, no future. Yet this secrecy produced something extraordinary. With each guild guarding its knowledge, techniques evolved in isolated pockets. And when cultures finally collided, on battlefields, along trade routes, or in quiet exchanges between traveling craftsmen, the results were explosive. Innovations that had grown in the dark suddenly met one another, creating leaps in metallurgy that reshaped entire eras. The blacksmith's code protected power, but it also sowed the seeds of breakthroughs no single world could have achieved alone. Part 5. Damascus steel and the accidental nanotech. As the Crusades swept across continents, Western knights marched into the Middle East expecting familiar battlefields, only to meet a weapon that shattered their confidence. Their opponents wielded swords unlike anything Europe had ever seen. These were the fabled blades of Damascus steel, instantly recognizable by their rippling, water-like patterns. Stories claimed they could slice a silk scarf drifting through the air, yet bend nearly 90 degrees without breaking. To the knights who faced them, they felt less like weapons and more like enchantments. And for centuries, Europe tried and failed to recreate them. By the 1700s, the method disappeared entirely. Damascus steel became a legend, a rumor of a lost art that no living smith could explain. Until 2006, a team of physicists in Dresden examined a genuine 17th-century Damascus saber under a high-resolution electron microscope, dissolving part of the blade to study its structure. What they discovered stunned the scientific world. Embedded inside metal forged 400 years earlier were carbon nanotubes and cementite nanowires, structures modern laboratories struggle to produce even today. Materials we dream of using for space elevators and advanced electronics were already hiding inside medieval swords. So how did smiths with no microscopes achieve something so advanced? The answer lies not in magic, but in chemistry and the intimate relationship between fire, ore, and repetition. True Damascus blades were forged from Wootz steel imported from India. Those ingots came from ores rich in trace elements like vanadium, chromium, and manganese. During the forging process, as the steel was heated, cooled, and folded again and again in a rhythmic thermal cycle, these impurities aligned into thin planes. They acted as catalysts, pull carbon from the charcoal fire, and assembling microscopic tubes and wires within the blade. Without knowing the theory, the smiths created a material both incredibly hard and astonishingly flexible. They solved metallurgy's deepest paradox long before science understood why their solution worked. The secret eventually vanished, not because smiths forgot the technique, but because the earth itself changed. The specific ore deposits containing those catalytic impurities were exhausted. Once the mines dried up, the recipe failed. The magic didn't die in human memory, it died in geology. And within that fading lies a lesson for us today. The Damascus smiths mastered their craft not through formulas or textbooks, but through relentless observation. They watched how metal behaved, how heat flowed, how impurities changed texture and sound. They achieved what looked like miracles simply by paying attention to the smallest details. In our world, drowning in distractions, that is a discipline we often lose. Yet greatness still hides in those subtle elements, the small habits we repeat, the patterns we notice, the details others overlook. If we slow down and truly observe, we can produce results that feel, to everyone else, like magic, just as Damascus steel once did. Part 6. The Soul of the Iron. To understand the true genius of the medieval blacksmith, you have to begin with the material he held in his hands. Today, we live in a world shaped by uniform, factory-made steel. Clean, predictable, engineered to behave exactly the same from one bar to the next. But the smiths of the past worked with something far more alive. They worked with wrought iron, a metal filled with character, memory, and flaws that turned out not to be weaknesses at all. Wrought iron was never pure. Threaded through every inch were hundreds of thousands of microscopic slag fibers, tiny glass-like strands sometimes packed more densely than grains of sand on paper. To modern industry, these impurities look like defects, but to the old master, they were a gift. Those threads formed a natural shield, slowing corrosion and protecting the heart of the metal. It is why modern steel fences crumble after a decade of rain, yet a wrought iron gate from centuries ago still stands outside an old farmhouse, unbent, unbroken, and untouched by time. Its imperfections made it immortal, and because of those fibers, wrought iron had a grain, like the grain of wood. You couldn't force it to obey. You had to listen. You had to coax it into shape, finding the lines where it wanted to bend, the direction in which it wanted to flow. The hammer was not a weapon, it was a voice. Every strike sent a question into the metal, and the metal answered through vibration, through sound, through resistance. This was craftsmanship, guided not by charts or instruments, but by instinct, sharpened through years of work. A master blacksmith never used a thermometer, he used his eyes. Dark red meant the iron was soft enough to shape. Bright red meant it was ready to draw out. Straw yellow meant the temperature was perfect for welding. But once it reached a blinding white, the warning was absolute. You had pushed the metal too far. One more breath of heat, and the iron would crumble into ash. This was not manufacturing, it was conversation. It was a language of heat and color and rhythm, a quiet dialogue between human will and the untamed forces of fire and earth. In every glowing bar of metal, the smith faced a simple truth. Control is never imposed, it is earned. And in that relationship between imperfection and patience lies the secret that gave iron its soul, and the blacksmith his art. The final lesson. When the Industrial Revolution arrived, the Bessemer process gave us something extraordinary. The ability to turn molten iron into vast quantities of uniform steel in minutes. With that leap, we built railways, bridges, skylines. We gained speed, scale, and power. Yet in that rush toward efficiency, something essential slipped through our fingers. We lost the intimacy between human hands and raw material. We forgot that strength often comes from imperfection, not its absence. The medieval blacksmith lived by a different code. He knew that flaws could protect, that impurities could guide, that patience shaped both metal and character. And in a world today that pushes us to be fast, polished, and endlessly replaceable, his wisdom offers a different path. You can choose depth over convenience. You can build skills that endure instead of chasing shortcuts. You can look at your own slag fibers not as damage, but as the structure that makes you resilient. The forges of the past may be cold, but their lessons remain hot and alive. The blacksmith's code: respect the process, embrace imperfection, and pursue strength with intention, is still a tool you can wield. Thank you for traveling through fire and centuries with us. If this story sparked something in you, consider liking the video, sharing it with someone who values the old ways, and subscribing to Historia Prime for more untold history. Until next time, keep forging your own path. Stay curious, stay resilient, and we will see you in the next video.